This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about the thing I am most reluctant to talk about on this channel. Not because it isn't important, it is possibly the most important conversation we will have here, but because it requires me to say out loud something that took me the better part of a decade to admit to myself that there were times in my life, real, documented, undeniable times, where I did not fail because of bad luck or bad timing, or a market that turned against me, or a partner who let me down. I failed because some part of me made sure I would. Not consciously, not with any intention I could identify in the moment. But looking back, with the clarity that distance and honest research eventually provide, the pattern is unmistakable. Every time I got close enough to the breakthrough to feel it, close enough that the possibility of real success became more concrete than theoretical, something would happen, a decision I can't fully explain, a behavior that came out of nowhere, a way of operating that seemed almost designed to take everything I had built and quietly dismantle it from the inside. Self-sabotage. Not as a dramatic, obvious act of destruction, but as a series of small, almost invisible choices that accumulated into the same result every time, the result of not quite making it, of coming close, always close, but never through. If you have ever watched yourself do this, if you have ever stood in the wreckage of something you built and known, somewhere underneath the rationalizations, that you had a hand in its collapse, then this conversation is for you, and I need you to stay with me all the way through. Because the explanation is not what most people expect, and the solution is not what the productivity world typically sells. I need to tell you about 2010, the year before the business finally collapsed, because by 2010 we were actually close. Closer than we had ever been. The contracts were coming in, the team had stabilized. The vision I had been carrying for 3 years was starting to show up in the real world in ways that were visible and measurable, and it was somewhere in the middle of that momentum, right in the thick of the closest thing to breakthrough I had ever experienced, that I started making decisions I cannot explain rationally even now. I began avoiding the most important client calls. Not all of them, just the ones that carried the most weight. I started arriving late to meetings I had always been early to. I picked unnecessary conflicts with my business partner over things that didn't matter. I began spending time on the peripheral parts of the business, the parts that felt busy but weren't critical, while the most important work quietly went unattended. At the time, I had explanations for all of it. Exhaustion, stress, the pressure of growth, all partially true, all completely insufficient as a full account of what was happening, because the deeper truth, the one I could not face then, was that something inside me was terrified of what success would actually mean, of who I would have to be on the other side of it, of whether the version of me that had been building toward this breakthrough was actually capable of sustaining it once it arrived. And rather than face that fear directly, rather than sit inside the vulnerability of genuine success, some part of me chose, quietly and without announcement, to resolve the uncertainty the only way it knew how, by making the outcome familiar again, by failing. Because failure, as painful as it was known. It was the territory I had navigated before, and the unconscious mind, as I would later discover through research that explained everything, will consistently choose the familiar pain over the unfamiliar possibility. The psychological architecture of self-sabotage is something that several researchers have mapped in detail. And when you understand the structure of it, when you can see the machinery underneath the behavior, it stops feeling like a personal defect and starts feeling like a solvable problem. The first framework that cracked this open for me comes from Dr. Nathaniel Branden, the psychologist and author whose decades of work on self-esteem produced one of the most important insights I have ever encountered on this subject. Branden argued that a person will never consistently allow themselves to experience a level of success, love, happiness, or achievement that exceeds their own deeply held belief about what they deserve. He called this the self-concept as a thermostat. Just as a thermostat regulates temperature back to its set point, cooling when the room gets too warm, heating when it gets too cold, the psyche regulates experience back to whatever level feels consistent with the person's core self-belief. When life begins to exceed that set point, when success, connection, or progress pushes above the level the person unconsciously believes they are entitled to, the system corrects, not through a conscious decision, through behavior, through choices that bring the temperature back down to the set point. This is self-sabotage at its most fundamental level, not an act of stupidity or weakness. A thermostat doing exactly what it was calibrated to do. The critical question then becomes, where was your thermostat set, and when was it calibrated? Because the self-concept thermostat is not set in adulthood. It is set in childhood and early adolescence. Through the messages received from parents, teachers, early experiences of failure and success, and the stories told about what a person like you is capable of and deserving of. Many of the people most prone to self-sabotage are people who received early messages, explicit or implicit, that ambition was dangerous, that success invited loss, that being too visible or too successful violated the unspoken rules of the family or community they came from. This connects to the work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist and trauma researcher at Boston University and author of The Body Keeps the Score. Van der Kolk's decades of research on trauma and its effects on behavior produced a finding that is directly relevant here. He found that unresolved early experiences, particularly experiences of shame, abandonment, or the association of success with danger, do not simply live in memory. They live in the body, in the nervous system. They produce automatic behavioral responses that are triggered not by conscious thought, but by the felt sense of approaching a threshold that the nervous system has learned to associate with threat. In plain language, for many people who self-sabotage, the approach of genuine success triggers a genuine threat response in the nervous system. Not because success is actually dangerous, but because at the level of early imprinting, exceeding certain thresholds was associated with outcomes that felt dangerous. Parental disapproval, social exclusion, the disruption of attachment relationships, punishment for standing out. The nervous system learned, early and durably, that a certain level of achievement or visibility is where things go wrong. And so every time life approaches that level again, the threat response fires, and the behavior that follows, the avoidance, the conflict picking, the sudden self-destruction, is not irrational. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, protecting you from a danger that no longer exists, but that the body has never been told is gone. Dr. Hendricks, the psychologist and author of The Big Leap, identified a specific version of this dynamic that he calls the upper limit problem. Hendricks observed in his clinical and research work that every person has an internal thermostat set for how much success, love, joy, and positive feeling they will allow themselves to experience before triggering a self-limiting behavior that brings it back down. He found that the closer a person gets to what he calls their zone of genius, their highest level of functioning and fulfillment, the more intensely the upper limit problem fires. The behaviors that appear right before a breakthrough are not accidental. They are the upper limit problem activating at its highest intensity, precisely because the breakthrough represents the greatest threat to the familiar set point. Hendricks identified 4 specific fear-based beliefs that drive upper limit behaviors. The belief that you are fundamentally flawed and don't deserve success. The belief that achieving too much will result in abandonment or betrayal by the people you love. The belief that your success is a burden or a threat to others. And the belief that if you shine too brightly, you will somehow destroy something. A relationship, a connection, a sense of belonging. Most people carry more than one of these. Many carry all 4. And they operate invisibly, running in the background of every major execution attempt until they are named. There is also critical research here from Dr. Robert Keegan and Dr. Lisa Laskow-Leahy at Harvard University, whose work on what they call the immunity to change produced one of the most practically useful frameworks for understanding self-sabotage I have ever encountered. Keegan and Leahy found through decades of research that what looks like resistance to change is almost always the result of a hidden competing commitment, a deep, unconscious goal that directly contradicts the stated goal. A person says they want to build a successful business, but underneath that stated commitment lives a hidden competing commitment to remain safe, to not exceed the family's level of achievement, to maintain the identity of someone who almost made it rather than face the vulnerability of someone who fully did. The behavior that looks like sabotage is, in Keegan and Leahy's framework, actually the person successfully pursuing the hidden competing commitment. The system is not broken. It is working perfectly, just in service of a goal the person has never consciously acknowledged. Their research showed that simply identifying the hidden competing commitment, bringing it into conscious awareness, and examining the deep assumption underneath it, produced measurable changes in the behavior that had previously seemed impossible to shift. Because the immune system of the psyche, like the immune system of the body, loses much of its power the moment you can see it clearly. Here is the practical work I want you to do. Not a theory exercise, real excavation. Take out something to write on. This matters enough to do in writing rather than in your head. Write down the area of your life where self-sabotage shows up most consistently. Be specific, not generally in my career. The specific pattern, Every time I get to a certain level of progress, I begin, and then name the behavior, the avoidance, the conflict, the sudden loss of momentum, the decision that makes no rational sense in retrospect. Now write the answer to this question. What is the worst thing that could realistically happen if I fully broke through in this area? Not the stated answer, the felt answer. The one that lives underneath the rational surface. Write it without editing. That answer, raw and uncleaned, is almost certainly sitting close to the hidden competing commitment that Keegan and Leahy describe, the fear that Hendricks calls the upper limit problem, the thermostat setting that Branden spent his career illuminating. Once you have it written, and this is the most important step, ask yourself one more question. How old is this belief? When did I first learn that exceeding this level was dangerous? You are not looking for a complete answer. You are looking for a glimpse. Because Kolk's research shows that the simple act of bringing a body-level threat response into conscious narrative awareness, of giving it language and a history, begins to shift the nervous system's relationship with it. Not instantly, not completely, but measurably. You are not trying to eliminate the fear in one sitting. You are trying to see it clearly enough that it stops operating from the shadows, and then, drawing on Gollwitzer's implementation intention framework, you write a specific if-then response for the moment the sabotage behavior typically appears. If I notice I am beginning to avoid the most important work right as momentum is building, then I will stop, name what is happening out loud, and take one small forward action before I do anything else. You are not trying to override the thermostat with willpower. You are inserting a conscious pause between the threat response and the self-sabotaging behavior. That pause, small as it sounds, is where the change begins to live. I want to close with something I have never said quite this directly on this channel before. The most painful version of failure is not the failure that comes from trying and falling short. It is the failure that comes from getting close enough to feel the breakthrough, and then watching yourself, in what feels almost like slow motion, make it not happen. I know that experience from the inside. I know the shame of it, the confusion, the way it confirms every story you have ever told yourself about being someone who almost makes it but never quite does. But here is what the research gave me that nothing else could. It was never about deserving it less than other people. It was never about being fundamentally flawed in a way that made success impossible. It was about a thermostat set in an old room, in an old time, by experiences that are no longer determining what is possible. Unless you let them continue to run unexamined, the breakthrough is not being blocked by the market or the timing or the competition. It is being blocked by a version of you that was formed before you knew what you were capable of. See it clearly. Name it honestly. And then take the one small step that tells your nervous system something new is possible. That is how the thermostat gets reset. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.